Good evening to all of you. Let me warmly welcome you all for the third Beyond Medicine lecture tonight. And may I cordially invite Professor Arosha Dasanayake, President, Ceylon College of Physicians, to introduce about the program.
Right, a very good evening to all of you. Warm welcome to our third Beyond Medicine lecture. The CCP has been conducting Beyond Medicine lectures this year with the intention of, one is of course, we cover things beyond our routine daily work. So some of these things are quite pleasurable to listen to. We've had one on Greek mythology by Dr. Chandima Amarasena. Then we had another lecture by Mr. Nisanka Dideni on drama music. One is, of course, pleasure, pure pleasure, because those are our interests. Then, of course, we believe that exposure to humanities and engagement with humanities perhaps contributes us to becoming better doctors, better understanding of our roles in the society, and better understanding of patients' wishes and thoughts. So with all of that in mind, we've been trying to reach out to different segments in the humanities through this program. And it is a pleasure to have an eminent photojournalist with us today. May I hand over to Dr. Disna, who is the lead of this Beyond Medicine program, to introduce the speaker and take over the program, the rest of the program this evening. Right, over to you, Disna. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. The eminent speaker today is someone who has mastered the art of speaking through images. He has an amazing eye for detail and has an innate ability to see the world around him differently. He's well known for his ability to see a photographic opportunity that an untrained eye might easily overlook. Mr. Gamunu Amarasinghe, an eminent and incredibly talented photojournalist who believes in compassion and social justice, will be presenting us live stories through the lens of a photojournalist tonight. So he's one of the finest Sri Lankan photojournalists of our time, and he started his career from Sunday Times. Currently, he's based in Washington. He's a former Associated Press photojournalist in transit via Thailand, Myanmar, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Mr. Gamunu is a member of the Pulitzer Prize winning team of journalists from Associated Press for the public service for documenting the use of slave labor in Southeast Asia to supply seafood to American tables, an investigation that spurred the release of more than 2,000 captive workers. He was also nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in 2014 for his coverage of tsunami in Sri Lanka. May I cordially invite Mr. Gamunu Amarasinghe to deliver his lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Disna, and thank you very much all for having me in this Saturday evening, some of you even without power. So my name is Gamunu Amarasinghe. I have been a photojournalist for the last 30 years. During that time, mostly I mostly worked in the areas with conflict and photographing and socially or visually documenting the lives of very vulnerable people. But today I'm going to basically structure this talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about my current life in Washington and what I do. Then move to China, basically have some kind of a comparison as a journalist experience I have had as a journalist working in both the places. And if time permits, move on to Myanmar a little bit and back to Sri Lanka, where my home is. So I'm going to start with, let me just share my screen to start with. So currently I work in Washington, and as I mentioned, probably we'll do a little bit of Myanmar and maybe a little bit of Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, if time permits, Sri Lanka. These are a couple of spot images from the locations that we probably will be talking today. On that note, I'll move to my life now, what I'm doing now. Most of my assignments these days are what we call spot news assignments, which means the news cycle is very short. I go, I shoot something, and it get published probably on the same day. That's the end of it. And out of this, though they are kind of one-day assignments, the whole functionality of it in a democracy or within the governance in Washington, it's kind of intriguing for me, mainly because it's where I have worked before. On that note, here is Andrews Air Base. One of my assignments, this is mostly going to Andrews Air Base. I go there, it takes a while to get there. Then it's one of the very secure air bases, and they accompany us inside. Then I get to go to the runway, basically where the planes are. And then we wait for a while, then we get to see 3 helicopters coming, and one of them early, then 2 after that, these 2. And in one of those is President Biden. And the helicopter lands, he walks down the stairs, he get greeted, then he get accompanied by the commander of the base, and he just walk from there to a plane. So basically he's transferring from Marine One to Air Force One. And I have done this so many times now, I know exactly it's going to take less than 2 minutes. And I kind of know exactly how many steps he's going to take between these 2. Yet then he walks up, he salutes, he does little, whatever he does, depending on the day, he get in, then he takes off and it goes. So as the flight disappears, that's the end of my assignment. And then it's a pretty simple thing. There's nothing strange about it. And I have done it so many times now. And no matter whether he comes in, sometimes he comes in motorcade, sometimes it's in the night, sometimes, it's snowing, sometimes it's rain. So no matter what, that's what I do. And why it is important for me, the functionality of it as a photojournalist, I will explain probably with my next segment, which is China. So other than the Biden and at Andrews Air Base, I photograph the Capitol, which is the Parliament, which is known here as the Capitol. Outside of it, inside of it. Then I photograph people with very different opinions. This is outside of one of the federal courthouses. And then I photograph a number of protests. This is outside of the Washington Monument. And I photograph protesters alone and in big numbers outside of the Supreme Court. These are 5 judges who basically, this protesters think should burn in hell. So this is what my day-to-day work for the last 1 year since I moved to Washington. Before that, it was a different story. Again, a little bit more about outside of the White House. This is like 3 weeks ago, since the abortion, the Supreme Court decided that different states can decide on whether, basically remove the constitutional rights for abortion. Since then, there have been a lot of protests, obviously, even before that, for and against. And this is outside the White House, where protesters decide to go and basically break civil law by attaching things to the White House gate, a fence. In doing so, endangering themselves to be detained, to bring out, basically to send a message, but none of them get detained. There were a lot of them. Eventually, none of them were detained. So, yeah, this is Secret Service trying to remove the bandanas they were putting on and protesters being vocal. These are pro and against, like pro-abortion and anti-abortion right protesters facing off outside the Supreme Court. So that's basically what I do these days. And from that, I'll basically jumped into China. And a few points about working in Washington with my background, simply because the places I worked and the experience I have had as a person with a camera, as a photojournalist, versus what is in Washington has been very different in a very positive way, right? And then about China, this is, I mean, China is a huge country with the population that we all know, and economically, it's a superpower now. With all of that, what I'm trying to bring in is a very small segment of pictures related to the contrasting governance versus in America or in a lot of other places. And this picture taken in is the Great Wall of China. Again, the Great Wall. And then you basically, Great Wall is great on the days like it's quiet, people can go in, and there are days which is basically a lot of soldiers, some are in uniform, some are not. And my experience in China working as a photojournalist is basically there were always someone looking over your shoulder. We all know like how it is invisibly through internet and many other ways. But even as a physical level, there's a lot of it. And I will try to explain my experience working there for a few months during two big conferences they have. The Chinese Communist Party have what is known as a CPPC, that is Chinese People's Political Conciliative Conference, as well as NPC, National People's Congress. Those two are the so all, like from the grassroots level, Communist Party members to a lot of people related to Communist Party, and the Communist Party like to show as affiliated with, come into China, and it's an annual conference over a 2 or 3 week period, and that take place in the Great Hall, the Chinese the Great Hall of the People, which is this building. And you may have seen pictures of what is pretty much like this, people outside posing for pictures and yeah, all of that. But today I'm going to talk about a very small segment of these guys, some with cameras in their hand, some with all the CCTV cameras all around the Tiananmen Square and in sensitive places. So during the NPC, this is quite early in the morning. We usually go there early. And in this particular day, it was snowing. And usual people who just come, and so they bring in all these people, not necessarily, they're not elected or anything, they're appointed from different ethnic groups. They're either business people or they dress in the ethnic clothes. Again, a very common pictures, and you have all these lovely ladies coming over to help with organizations and all that, and they post for pictures and they take their own pictures right in front of this is in Tiananmen Square. And then inside the hall, everything is very meticulous, from tea servicing to cleaning to everything is in pretty great shape. Mind you, this story was done in 2010, so these leaders are not there anymore. But the system that has existed only gotten a lot more unbearable for journalists to work. So going further, this is inside the building. And this is outside on a particular day, that's early in the morning. And every day before the conference starts, you have army of soldiers coming and removing everybody from the square. And in this particular day, we saw in a subway station, there's this woman, she's fainted. This is like 6 in the morning, and no one was getting close to her. And because people they were concerned, because this is one of the tricks that protesters, a very slim amount of protesters follow. I mean, during this summit, during these 2 meetings, basically political gatherings, traditionally there are a lot of people from rural places, farmers, teachers, and people with, they think that they have been unfairly treated. They used to come to Beijing, and that is a tradition for a very long time. And they would come and basically to get attention to their grievances. But the Chinese don't like it. The Communist Party or the security don't like it. So they make every possible way to stop them from coming in. If they come in, stop them from getting into the venue. If they get into the venue, detain them as fast as possible and put them into the police vehicles and move them away before any journalist sees it. And usually what we mostly see is just this policeman has leaflet in his hand, and the protester who had this leaflet, not the same woman, some other person, already being pushed into that van, so you can't even see him. And they collect all the leaflets that this person brought for the attention of their leaders, or the attention of media, for attention of anyone who can listen to them, who will listen to them. And usually it's pretty hard to see them these days, even in 2010. Now it's finally like even harder. But on the final day of the meeting, which is the second one, NPC, it was snowing and things were a little loose. At the very end, there was something was happening, maybe because of the unexpected snowing. A number of protesters managed to get closer. And this person, by the time we saw him, he's already being stopped by a policeman and being dragged. And they are more concerned about it's being recorded than the protester himself, if there are journalists. So, and it's the same protester. So he just coming over, asking this journalist what he was doing, and basically try to get his attention to an extent that he can't actually take pictures of him. It's a common trick that they use. He's just pushing him away, then going back to him, try to questioning, I guess. There's another woman just on the other side of the road, and she had these documents and CDs with her grievances. Again, she got detained very quickly. and she get pulled away and pushed into the van. Talking about vans, in one occasion, what happened was I was photographing, not this particular occasion, another occasion, and the police got a little confused, and they basically kind of pushed me into a van with the protesters. So I took pictures inside the van, which was very pleasing for my agency, because they had not have pictures of protesters inside a Chinese police vehicle before. Same thing, but then they realized they did something wrong. They pushed me out as fast as they could. Another protester, same thing, intimidation with video cameras. This is me. So, and they use umbrellas too. They use umbrellas for the similar purpose, not just for the rain, but to cover things from protesters. So it's simply my thinking is, I mean, in Sri Lanka, I grew up. One of the reasons why I become a journalist, because my belief of being a journalist and understanding the fundamentals of how journalism work in a functional democracy. As much as we have doubts about the functionality of the different democracies, I mean, in Sri Lanka versus China versus states, the bottom line is the China and the different branches of the government. Like you have the executive, you have the legislative, you have the courts, and you have the media. And in China, all of those above is pretty much controlled by the Communist Party. So it was a quiet awakening for me, especially working in places like Nepal, where people thought they would rather have Chinese running their country, some of them, simply because their government was so corrupt and non-functional. I always think you have to think twice if you really are serious about your personal liberties and simply the right to speak, right to write, right to think and be expressive, all of that, no matter how difficult some of these things are in the democracies we have in Sri Lanka and in other places. Actually having that in a constitution and in a somewhat functional way, you will not know what you lose it till you lose it, then it's too late. On that note, I think I'll move to different country. It's a I worked in Myanmar for from 2011 till about 2016, and sometimes before that visiting. And one of the things really stunned me was the Rohingya people and how they were systematically taken all their rights away by successive Burmese military governments, as well as the small periods when they had their democratic governments. And this is the level of living standards when it's come to very basic things like health, education, I mean, even livelihoods, access to anything, access to services, or freedom to travel. And all these things were pretty much restricted in Rakhine State, which is the eastern, southeastern part of Myanmar, which is bordering Bangladesh. And it's a very complex story. There are, if you ask a Burmese person, you'll hear a certain side of the story. If you ask a Rohingya person, you hear another side of the story, and if you ask a Bangladeshi person, another story. It's a very, they have had a very complex history, and of course, like in some other places, everyone will blame the British for how and what they left behind after the occupation in Indochina. So this story is what stunned me in many ways. The amount of healthcare, like what even me, I'm not a healthcare. I have a very little healthcare background, just as a recipient, but seeing like what is accessible for a lot of these people, and to hide the fact that what is existing, how the Burmese government has restricted access to these areas and not keeping records of what is going on. Like there are no census being done for a long time. The records are so cooked up, and you never know. And from the time we started working there, we heard a lot about children dying at birth or living like very short periods of time. And it was very, these numbers were, I mean, the talks were there all the time we were hearing, but we never really see the actual gravity of it, given there are no statistics being kept. The hospitals, there were a couple of hospitals in these areas. Their healthcare, the medicines are very limited. Trained professionals are very limited, and it's very systematic how what is there I mean, it's there because that's how it has been systematically. They have basically made what it is now. So this story about a lady who she was we saw her on a day in 2014 in the evening. She was few days, she was due to give birth like a couple of days early. She has not done it, and she was in pain when we saw her. She was and her name is, she's 20-year-old. Her name is Samsha Nashidu. And we saw her, and the midwife was there. She's really worried, and as there were restrictions of traveling outside of their village, they could not go to even the closest dispensary. So their only hope was the midwife, who basically, the midwives are very well experienced there, but anything beyond ordinaries, they can't handle. And then the following day morning, when we went back again, so she was in tears, and next to her, so she had given birth in the night, and in her house, a bamboo house, which is in a camp for refugee, for internally displaced people. So they moved there in 2012 after the communal riots there between the Buddhist Rakhine people and Muslim Rohingya people. And so this is her husband up here. He's 24 years old. He already has a couple of kids. This is one of their younger kids. And this is her husband's mother, her mother-in-law. And then there's this little mat and something covered. And once eventually they we opened that, and there was this child, and they cleaned her up, they washed her, they dressed her, and they took her for burial. And the birth and the death, this is such a, it's not for children birth and deaths are so ordinary. It's just the family members and even the bystanders. It's a pretty common thing. And this is the body in the mosque, and they prayed and dug a little hole in the ground and buried her. And that was, this is the mother back in home. So that's basically I have a hard time basically having words to explain that whole situation, because it's just one example of the dignity of life in these Rohingya areas. And this is before the most recent, what the military did, something called a clearance operation, which led to a couple of 100,000 Rohingya to flee their homes to Bangladesh. So that's another place that very challenging to work for journalists to get there and to do stories. And they are very vulnerable people. And I, even up to now, I have a not so comforting feeling about doing this story, recording it and sharing it. But I thought this was the right audience to do it, given what you all do. And it's one of those challenging positions, like situations like there's no way I can tell the story. People, I mean, you can write this, but the power the visuals has as an example of this is what's going on must convince me to do it. And if you have any questions about it, how I approached it, I'm happy to answer the best I can. From that, I think I'll move to Myanmar again, and this is a story that won AP its first public service Pulsar Award, and Dr. Disna didn't leave much for me to talk about. She tell about it. She did a really good job of explaining what it was all about. Thank you. And it's a heartbreaking story. The guy in this picture, he's from Myanmar, and like a lot of other poor people in Myanmar and in Cambodia, he was fooled to come to Thailand for a construction or some other job. And he was fooled into get into a fishing trawler, and he was taken to a small island in Indonesia, and he was kept in a camp, and he was not paid for 22 years. He went to sea every day in a fishing trawler, and like with his colleagues in the boat, except very few, they had to fish very long hours for all that time period. And other fishing boats, like the trawler, the freezer facilities, came into their boat mid-sea, got everything that they caught, and process it in the fish and send it to consumers all around the world, including in Washington, including in US. It's a story that took us a little over 2 years to do. It's a very challenging story for a photojournalist to do, because the time you go anywhere with a camera, especially in a small island that with a lot of fish slaves, there's a likelihood of you don't come back again. We did 6 stories on this series about the fish slaves. This part, we have had more of control over access, given knowing that when my colleagues met them in Indonesia, and eventually when IOM arranged them to respective people from Myanmar to travel to Myanmar, we met him at the airport months after. So this is him arriving in Yangon, and they all were taken into a facility that is the Burmese government had. So they were checked for, I don't know, communal diseases or basic healthcare kind of thing. So they spent overnight in this facility. Then the following day, they traveled from that to their respective villages. In this case, again, IOM took him to closest town where he lives, which is Mon State. That was a town in the southern eastern part of Myanmar, bordering Thailand. This is a bunch of them in a bus. Some of them have already been in touch with their families. Some of them thought they were dead, and they're going to see their families like after a long time. This is when they're in Mon State, their state capital. Again, a lot of paperwork, more paperwork. Then finally they were getting ready to go to their own villages. This is when he arrived in his own village. That was his sister when he left, who was 6 years old, now married with children. This is his mother. It was a very emotional reunion after so many years. And the mother and sister ran halfway in their little village to see him coming in. So the mother poured a bucket of water with vermicelli out to purify him. This is him. Sister gave him a bath to wash off all the demons that he was bringing back, which is the moon belief. Mother, he was so by the reunion emotion, she fainted. It was pretty emotional for him, and the villagers came to see him, and he was greeting the elderly, telling more stories with his nephews, with his sisters, son and daughter. This is their house, living room. So that's one of the 6-part stories that One AP, its first public service. Pulitzer in 2016. On that, I think I'm not sure whether I'm moving on too fast, but I think if there's any question, if I need to be slowed down or something, I hope Arosha, you can pin me.
Yeah, no, you're fine. You carry on. The speed is fine, Gamanu. No problem.
Okay. And then from that, I think I'll move on to Sri Lanka and so it's a little story I'm going to tell you now without many pictures, while I have this pretty picture on the screen. It's a picture taken in Sri Lanka in 2007 when a couple of thousand people left Wahre area when Sri Lankan military started retaking the east stretch of the area that was under LTT control. So in 2000, this is like going back to my roots. This is East Coast. I was born in Batticaloa. That was, so anytime going back to East is very, very soothing for me. This circumstances is not necessarily one of those, but it took me a while to realize why I like Batticaloa. Then I realized it's all the lagoons, and on a days that there are no wind, the lagoon become like a total mirror. So you see all this blue sky and the cloud reflected in the lagoon. So and that somehow kind of got into my head when I was a child. And anytime I go to Batticaloa or East Coast, that's what I see. Though even in circumstances that is totally not that. Again, a little back from the history, how I become a photojournalist. I think it's a good time to talk because we are going to talk about Sri Lanka. In 2000, actually in 1990, after I did my advanced level exams, there was the universities were closed, and there were a lot of there were a lot of problems with the whole education system by then with the JP uprising. And then I was a amateur photographer and then self-taught. So I basically I never had any formal training as a photojournalist. So I sent applications to all the national newspapers saying, I realized that you have a vacancy for a trainee photographer, and would you be willing to look at my portfolio? And for much of my surprise, Mr. Singarasa Ratnatunga at Sunday Times got his secretary to call me back and asked me to come over, and I put together some work I had done by then, basically birds in some parks and pictures I took in schools and holidays, and I went in for an interview without actually thinking I'm going to get any training position. But I was Sunday Times gave me a training photographer position and asked me to come over for a couple of days a week to work, which I did. And in there, I actually ended up meeting Professor Arosha Dissanayake, who was a journalist there, for some of you that may know. and he was working in investigations desk with Mr. Iqbal Atas and my colleague Niresh Eliathambi and some others. So among other things, Sunday Times was a wonderful place to meet people. And thanks to Sunday Times, I met Arosha, who happened to be a neighbor eventually when we figured that out. So on that note, I'll go back to Batticaloa again, simply because I was not in the country when the mass refugee or in IDP crisis happened in 2009, following the war and the end of the conflict. So this is the closest that I have, which is in a much smaller scale, given to what happened in 2009 and 10. But it's kind of relative given the circumstances and what goes on in a life of IDP. So this kid is flying a kite made of shopping bags in their resettlement or settlement. All of this happened when people, because of the fighting, when people had to leave the areas that they were living for a long time. So the Wahre and the area between Batticaloa and Trincomalee, mostly fish agricultural and fishermen. So they used the vehicles they had to travel, most of them towards the Batticaloa rather than towards Trinco. Versus some of the families coming down. So quite a contrast to what happened in the north, how they managed to come, the final lot of people to earlier stages in Batticaloa, East Coast. Okay, then and some people just use their bicycles, and with the fear of actual LTT infiltrations, there was security and checking in all the routes that refugees came in. Again, pretty much similar to the north. Families in their bicycle with all their belongings. White flags. White flags. In this occasion, most of them help white flags, unlike in the north. This is one of the earliest campsites that UNHCR facilitated then. And here's someone that some of you may know. This is Dr. Vardhan Vardaraja, who was a doctor at Wahre Hospital when all these things happened. And at one stage, there was a lot of pressure on him to leave the area, because I think there's an idea of like, if there's no hospital, that would encourage more people to leave, because there's no way of but he and a midwife stayed through quite last stages of the war, and here he is going into a camp to collect one of the bags that he managed to put into a tractor to bring back. So he's going back to collect his belongings. And I spotted him, and I saw this very elderly Tamil women going and bowing down and touching his feet, which is very unlikely in a Tamil society. which is basically treating him like a god, which made me speak to him and find out what was going on. There's a lot of affection towards him. People were crying. And then eventually, it's ironical, he ended up becoming the district medical officer in Mullaitivu during the final stage of the war. And the circumstances following that, I think you all are, some of you are aware, and eventually he had to leave the country for his own good. So he's not in Sri Lanka anymore. So that's Dr. Vardhan, and this is a little bit of pictures of camp life, people getting used to, settling into camp lives. It's children eventually getting used to their new settlement and playing. This kid is pulling a half of plastic, a broken plastic bucket as a toy, what he can find. And this kid is chasing bugs. This kid is flying a kite made of, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 shopping bags. And his father is taking his family. At that stage of the crisis, like there was, the government accepted help from UNHCR and other UN agencies in reasonably big way, which set up some kind of a structure, which usually you see in a situation like this, rather than government or the military doing it. There were troubles. There were breakaway factions of the LTTE was strong in these areas. So they were killing between the killings of what they thought were spies or sympathetic people towards the other faction. And at the end of every killing, it was the families that was left to suffer. And so when they were crossing the borders, the spotters or the screening, people who knew who was coming would just basically spot people, and they get removed. Most of the time, like to be seen in police stations much later, but some of the times not to be disappeared with no trace, which a lot of it happened much later, I guess, in Mullaitivu, in final stages of the conflict. And this sector, I finished with this girl. She was 4 years old. She was trying to take shelter or to be safe, just basically pulling and hiding into her father's sarong in one of the transit places. And I always thought, like, what would happen to her, like when the circumstances end, and how would that end? And so all those questions still in my mind. On that note, that's basically the little bit I have on the eastern part of Sri Lanka, and I'll run a little bit of what happened during at the same time, around the same time in Kilinochchi and beyond, like in the LTT control areas. And this is, you may see, it's a milestone 190. It's between it's in LTT control areas, and these guys who are patrolling part of the volunteer forces of the LTT. And it's quite, when you really look at it at that stage and what they were doing, the methods the LTT used to keep their organization strong, how much resources that took away from the people who were living there was astonishing. It's a war that lasted for a couple of reasonably long time. So the tactics and the tactics change along the way, and the borders went back and forth. The level of brutality changed, the level of access we had changed, the level of crimes committed by both the parties changed. So this, what I'm showing here without much information, does not necessarily represent the whole period of the war where LTTE control a chunk of land. But this is a slim idea of what was going on, especially for the people who are much younger to see it or know it or have heard it from a different point of view. So these guys are farmers. They were given, depending on where, this is A9 road, the main road to Jaffna, and they were given certain stretch of the road to patrol. And the idea was basically, this was the time that the military had their, the smaller units, that penetrating units that would go and set up bombs and kill LTT hierarchies. So their job was to make sure that the road is clear at this particular time of the day. And he basically, I spoke to him and I asked him, what are these dogs? He said, one of his dogs, the other one is neighbors. He just, and why you going with the dogs? He said he feels safer and he has seen it in the movies. There are dogs can sniff, danger. So he's walking with them. And what is happening here is towards a certain age, certain periods of the war, LTTE when they were short of manpower for a number of different things, as their area grew bigger, they needed more manpower. So no matter whether you were a teacher or a government servant paid by the government, if you are living there, you basically had to do what they say. And these guys, most of the families has already given one or two people, one or two children. If you're living in the north, the main chunk of the land, and if you are in a certain socioeconomic, you have to give a child, sometimes two. And if you are wealthy, you pay money. So these guys were these people sitting on the ground on their military training, compulsory military training, and they all were given a card and they were deployed to do work related to security that LTT would ask them to do certain hours of a week. So they were just getting, and they were given physical training. And yeah, no matter how old you were, you just had to go through it. And this is a section of the A9 road. And Morris Minor was obviously the vehicle of the choice, that part of the world during this time. And what happened during the war, people with more sickness, and if they can afford, if they had means, they would either get transferred to Jaffna or to Colombo, or people go to Jaffna, or some people from Mullaitivu or wherever in the LTT controls areas might go and stay relatively, if they think it's relatively safe to live in Jaffna, they will go in Jaffna. And this particular person, he died of natural cause in Jaffna, and his body is brought back to his village for burial on the top of the car. And here are some female cadres of the LTTE. This is again newly recruited volunteer and otherwise recruited female cadres doing their training, running in road in close to Hinochi off A9 road. Oops. And they get some sort of military training as well at that stage. Oops. Okay. Yeah, LTT control area. This is another farmer who had to guard the road. And these this is the card that they're supposed to get signed when they come for training. Yeah, so that's a glimpse of LTT civilian life in LTT control areas during the conflict. And on that note, I'll probably move to a little bit more of the LTT control areas. This is a school. It was a morning assembly, somewhat important day, so raise the flag. And this is a ceremony, annual ceremony to remember what they considered as a first female suicide cadre, or is it suicide? Who died during actually fighting the Indian peacekeeping force. So they glorified the death as the ultimate sacrifice and mobilized people to follow that suit for a long time very successfully and continuing the war. This is one of their light forces. This guy has LTT colors pinned into his back with safety pins. showing his admiration. This is in Kilinochchi. And during all these ceremonies, which were a lot, people had to participate. Again, no matter what you do, whether you, but the truth is, like most of these families, because given how long the war lasted, they either had someone in the organization, or they had someone died fighting in the organization, or they most of them basically didn't see any other way. So they participated in all these events. Okay, the LTT was pretty much day-to-day life of school kids and functions they had, and some very young children as well. And this is one of the floats that that they did for glorifying their war dead. And these floats would go around in their control areas and tracking more and more people for their cause. And that was, well, they were a pretty good propaganda machine when they were at this stage. This is one of those exhibitions kind of a thing they had, so people could visit and they would explain how they overran a camp, and they would show how certain weapons, how to operate certain weapons, which was a huge attraction for young kids to come over. That's a picture framing shop in Kilinochchi. And they had their own police. So this is the police station sign in Kilinochchi again. It's a school in, actually the main school in Kilinochchi, which is I think reconstructed now. And this guy is selling kerosene oil that is used in motorbikes, because it's petrol, I don't know, diesel. For the longest time, because of the restrictions that government had put upon the area, a lot of things that were lot of goods are available in the south of Sri Lanka were not available in LTT controlled areas, simply because the idea of using them for like military purposes. So people are pretty used to living in those areas, pretty used to living with that. Their needs were minimum in many ways, and a lot of them use bicycles. And they had courts. I'm not really familiar with the functionality of it. Anytime I have seen the judges, they look like 16-year-olds to me. This kid is a little older than that. But they were trying to, well, they successfully had an infrastructure that basically running their own parallel show to the central government, or they tried. So this is their quote. And again, they were masters of propaganda. The glorification of war was the level of it pretty unbelievable. I think the Sri Lankan military probably copied it towards the very end of the war to finish it the way it finished. Again, this is commemoration for black tigers, like the suicide cards that they have had. School children were taken to these memorial places, like on school tours. They were very familiar with the concept of suicide from a very young age. So that's a little bit about the LTT life in, the life fund LTT in the areas that they control. This is before 2009. On that note, Arusha, how are we with the time?
Well, I mean, we've spent quite some time. I think we've gone for about a little more than 1 hour. So I think about 1 hour and 15 minutes, I think we've covered a fair amount of ground. We could just get listener to see whether anybody would like to ask you anything, and then probably if you want to add anything in at last to add that and call it a day. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, I think I went a little over. I would have finished a little early, I guess. Yeah, if you, yeah, I think we'll wrap it up there.
Do you want to see whether anybody wants to ask Yamunu anything?
Yes, now, Mr. Yamunu Amarasinghe, thank you very much for your wonderful, impressive as well as colorful presentation. I would say it's like a very rare kind of presentation, and I personally feel it like a visual record of the histories. And now it's the time for the audience, and you all are mostly welcome for the questions, even the questions with regard to the technical issues of photography. Our eminent speaker is happy to answer. So it's your time.
So actually the others type in a question. Now Gamunu happens to be a very, very close friend of mine. And I know that he has been declared persona non grata in 2 countries, a very rare achievement. Now you had to leave 2 countries, not 1. I think that might be of some interest to just for us to spend a little time on, if you don't mind. I mean, I don't know whether you're okay to talk about it or otherwise. If you're not, that's all right. But because obviously you've not covered the last little bit of the war. So obviously you had to leave Sri Lanka before that. Do you want to talk about it or not want to talk about it?
I can talk about it. I mean, briefly without naming anyone. Yeah, so 2009 was a pretty tough time for journalists in Sri Lanka, especially who covered Northeast. Not that we had the access the way that we want, but the whole approach of the either you with us or you against us was basically and Lasantha got killed, and I here's the thing. I mean, I had to leave in 2009 simply because someone in the military was not very comfortable with the reporting job we did I did it in January of 2009. So we were told. I mean, like we were told. I mean, I was told it's time to leave. Otherwise, consequences can be not good. So I left in 2000. I mean, like this has been the case for like a lot of us during a couple of years. So, and we always think, oh, it's Colombo. We know someone. We know someone who go to school or whatever the side, and you basically neutralize it because these are not legal threats. It's not I have been breaking a law or anything. So that being the case, I tried to do the same, but by then, Associated Press that I worked for, they approached certain officials in the government and powerful officials, and the message was clear that it's good for me to get away for a bit. So I very unceremonially left Sri Lanka in 2009 and thinking that I can come back in 2 weeks. But of course, I mean, it was really tough to come back and work. Eventually, which I did in 2012. I mean, in our part of the world, like it's become like a occupational hazardness, like not getting visas to travel, not getting, it's pretty much somewhat like a feather in your cap, like you're doing the right thing. It's the best way to take it, I think.
Yes, I mean, Gamanu and I, as Gamanu mentioned, worked in the Sunday Times together, and some of our colleagues in that had bad times. Obviously, Lasantha Wickramatunge, who was the news editor. Was he news editor? What was he? Your political editor. The political editor, we all know what happened to Lasantha. And then, of course, Keith Noya and I worked as cub journalists together. Lalit Alahakon, who again got beaten up. Lalit was at that time the news editor. So life has been tough to, my own boss, Iqbal Atas, had his home and everything shot at. So people would not look very kindly at some other journalists who would report things as they were, right? And then of course there were people within the journalists themselves who would, would warn officials, oh, so and so should be moved, that kind of thing. So that's how life has been. So tell us, why were you sent out of Burma?
Oh, it's an interesting question. So, with the Sri Lankan passport, the places you can travel in a hurry is very limited. So luckily I had a visa to go to India by that time that was valid. So I went to India thinking it's a few weeks or a few months, and when it was getting longer, I was really unhappy in Delhi. It was too big and too flat for me to understand. And there were a lot of Indians too. So I could go to Nepal without a visa, with a Sri Lankan passport, visa on arrival, which I did. And I really loved Nepal. So I was working for Associated Press, and they were facilitating me to move to Nepal, which I did. And then when AP realized the Burma, Aung San Suu Kyi was supposed to come out of her house arrest in 2010 or 11, and they wanted people to try to go in, and this is not the current military government, the former military government time. And then they asked a couple of us, would we be keen? If so, shall we try to get a visa to go in as tourists, of course, at this stage, because they would not issue visas for journalists. And I remember in Nepal going to the Myanmar embassy to get a visa, and the visa guy, officer, I sat in front of his desk, and behind him was this huge window overlooking the Annapurna range of mountains. And he asked me, why you go to, and in my passport, in my application, I put myself as a photographer, which is kind of half truth, but truth. And he asked, what do you photograph? And I looked at the window behind him with all these snow-capped mountains. And I told him, mountains. Then he stood up, pointed his finger at me, and I said, okay, this is how it's going to end. He said, I trust you. Nature. I said, yeah. So I got a visa. So I went to where in a lot of other places, Myanmar embassy was refusing to give visas. Maybe the rogue Myanmar government thought that rogue Sri Lankan visa holder, passport holder would be okay. I don't know exactly the thinking. So I went to Myanmar and we played cat and mouse with then military government, spies and all of that. And eventually the biggest concern was actually not to get caught before she was released. And you obviously get caught, likelihood of getting caught is very likely when she's released. But then eventually, we managed to stay in. Some got caught, I did not. So I took pictures of when she was released from the house arrest. And then eventually the Burma changed and they allowed the kind of semi-democratic government, which is basically ex-military commanders. They want a lot of things change, like because they have by this time they have made enough money and they just wanted some legitimacy and their children to go to other countries to study and all of that kind of stuff. They want their black money to be cleaned, I guess. So they allowed media organizations to actually register, and that came up with they basically offered these foreigners working for foreign agencies journalist visa. So the agency I worked with, the Associated Press, was the first one to get a registration as a foreign news agency in Myanmar in 2011, and we got 3 visas, and I was one of the people that they picked to go and work there in Myanmar. So that was a very visual experience. I mean, visually it was beautiful. What people, you could see when they say, I want democracy, which you all refer as democracy. What they meant was like they thought that was going to bring food into their table, their children's going to be safer, their children will have education, and all of that was become reasonably true with the election of Aung San Suu Kyi. But again, with the most recent all of this has been completely turned back around. It's a vicious cycle.
Right, Dishna, is there any other question?
Actually, at the moment, it seems to be that there's no other questions. And on behalf of Sri Lanka College of Physicians, I heartily thank Mr. Gamanu Amarasinghe for sharing your experience as well as allocating time for us despite your busy schedule. And actually, it was really interesting to listen to the stories about rights, justice, conflicts, wars, and communities. So thank you once again for illuminating this evening. And I also would like to thank you, the audience, for their participation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Dishna, and thank you, Professor Arosha, and thank you for spending 1.5 hours in your Saturday evening spending with me. And you all have a good evening.
Thank you, Gamanu. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Thanks for those wonderful photographs. Thank you.
Bye-bye.